As the Allies closed in on Nazi Germany during the final months of World War II, the regime's collapse seemed inevitable. The military was shattered, cities lay in ruins, and Hitler's power was crumbling. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming defeat, the Nazi leadership attempted one last desperate measure to prolong the fight: the creation of werewolves, a guerrilla force aimed at terrorizing the occupying forces and ensuring the survival of the Nazi ideology. The SS Werewolves were conceived as an underground resistance movement. Their inspiration came from the ancient folklore of the werewolf, a creature half human, half beast, capable of unleashing terror from the shadows. The Nazis, in their obsession with mythology and symbolism, saw in this creature the embodiment of the kind of ruthless fighter they needed. A werewolf did not play by the rules of conventional warfare. It struck at night, disappearing before anyone could retaliate. This metaphor seemed perfect for what Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, and other top Nazi officials envisioned: a force of committed fighters who would sabotage Allied efforts to rebuild and control Germany. The werewolf idea emerged late in 1944 as the war was clearly turning against Germany. Himmler, notorious for his brutal and often impractical plans, believed that young Germans, especially those indoctrinated in the Nazi youth, could be trained as elite guerrilla fighters. These werewolves would ambush convoys, assassinate collaborationists, and sabotage key infrastructure like railways and bridges. Their goal was to create a constant state of terror and chaos behind enemy lines, frustrating the Allied occupation and forcing them into a prolonged conflict. To begin the werewolf program, Himmler's SS selected recruits from the Hitler Youth and fanatical Nazi Party members, young men and women indoctrinated into the belief that dying for the Führer was the ultimate honor. The recruits were sent to secret camps in remote forests, where they received intensive training in sabotage, assassination, and guerrilla tactics. There, they learned how to plant bombs, set ambushes, and live off the land for extended periods. The training was brutal, focusing not just on the technical skills of warfare, but also on reinforcing their ideological commitment to the Nazi cause. Instructors hammered into their heads that they were no longer human. They were werewolves, creatures of vengeance and terror. Yet, despite the mythical imagery surrounding them, the SS Werewolves were far from the invincible shadow warriors the Nazis had hoped to create. For one, the timing of their formation was a disaster. By late 1944, Germany was already in a death spiral. The country's resources were depleted, and there was little time or means to train or equip these recruits properly. Many werewolf operatives were sent into battle with little more than basic weapons, facing the overwhelming firepower of the advancing Allies. Moreover, the chaos and confusion of the war's end made it difficult for them to coordinate effectively. Despite these challenges, some werewolf units managed to carry out acts of sabotage and violence. One of the most infamous incidents attributed to the werewolves was the assassination of Franz Oppenhoff, the newly appointed mayor of Aachen, in March 1945. Oppenhoff had been installed by the Allies to help manage the reconstruction of the city, and his assassination was meant to serve as a warning to anyone who would collaborate with the occupying forces. The killers, a team of SS Werewolves, carried out the assassination with chilling efficiency, traveling behind enemy lines, identifying their target, and executing him in front of his home. Such acts, while terrifying, were relatively rare. For the most part, the SS Werewolves were a largely ineffective force. Many of the recruits were teenagers with minimal combat experience, and their guerrilla tactics were no match for the disciplined armies of the Allies. The Allies, having dealt with organized military resistance for years, were also well equipped to counter insurgencies. They quickly established control over occupied territories, and any werewolf activity was swiftly and brutally suppressed. The collapse of the Third Reich in May 1945, with Hitler's suicide and Germany's unconditional surrender, left the werewolf program leaderless and adrift. Some hardline Nazis still clung to the hope of continuing resistance, but the reality on the ground was that the vast majority of the German population wanted an end to the war. The destruction and loss suffered by ordinary Germans made the idea of further resistance unthinkable to most. Still, Nazi propaganda continued to push the myth of the werewolves even after the war's end. Goebbels had used his propaganda machine to encourage the German population to believe in a last-minute victory, and stories of werewolves' actions were used to stoke fear and hope in equal measure. Radio broadcasts in the final days of the war spoke of werewolf units fighting valiantly behind enemy lines, but in reality, these tales were largely fabricated. Most werewolf units either disbanded or were captured, their plans thwarted by the sheer magnitude of Germany's collapse. After the war, the myth of the SS Werewolves lingered, feeding into post-war fears about Nazi remnants continuing their fight underground. The Allies took this threat seriously, with military leaders in both the United States and the Soviet Union initially worried that Germany could devolve into a hotbed of insurgency, much like the resistance movements they had faced elsewhere during the war. However, these fears proved unfounded. The vast majority of German citizens were exhausted by the war and wanted nothing to do with continued resistance. The SS Werewolves, far from becoming a feared underground movement, faded into obscurity. In the years that followed, the story of the SS Werewolves took on a life of its own, fueled by Cold War paranoia and the enduring fascination with Nazi mysticism and mythology. The werewolves came to symbolize the fanaticism and desperation of a regime on the verge of annihilation. They were a testament to the lengths the Nazi leadership was willing to go to in order to hold on to power, even as their empire crumbled around them. The SS Werewolves were ultimately more of a psychological weapon than a practical one. Their very existence was meant to instill fear in both the Allies and the German population, a reminder that the Nazi regime, though defeated, could still strike from the shadows. Yet in the end, the werewolves were little more than a last futile gasp of resistance from a regime that had already lost. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please like, share, and subscribe to Compressed History for more in-depth explorations of the past.